Fear smelled like expensive cologne and silence. Choi Seung-woo had learned this early, at age 12, watching a boardroom full of grown men go quiet the moment his father walked in. Not out of respect, out of dread. He'd filed that observation away like a blade, sharp-edged and patient, and by 45, he'd become the thing people went quiet for. CEO of Choi Global Industries. Net worth, classified but whispered in the billions. Tall enough to make doorways feel like suggestions. A jawline carved from stubbornness, eyes the color of deep water before a storm. He moved through Seoul's elite circles like a predator that had long since stopped needing to hurry. He had never once had to ask for anything twice. Until the night he walked into a Lagos hotel lobby and saw Imani Brooks laughing. She wasn't supposed to matter. She was incidental, a footnote in the elaborate game he was playing against Victor Ademi, the Lagos property tycoon who had built his empire on a foundation of stolen blueprints. Blueprints that had once belonged to Seung-woo's late mentor, Chairman Park, a man who had treated Seung-woo like a son when his own father never quite managed it. Victor had taken everything from Chairman Park, reduced a proud man to debts and disease, and then attended his funeral wearing a smile disguised as condolences. Seung-woo had spent 3 years positioning himself for this moment. Victor's one weakness was his daughter, not biological, but beloved. The woman he'd raised from age 7 after a car accident took her parents. The woman who stood to inherit 30% of Ademi Holdings the day she married. Imani Brooks. Seung-woo had done his research. He expected someone polished and performative, sculpted by privilege into the shape of a trophy. He expected someone easy to manipulate. He did not expect this. She was standing near the hotel fountain, laughing at something an elderly porter had said, her head thrown back with complete abandon. No performance. No audience management. She wore a simple burnt orange wrap dress that moved like it was alive, her warm brown skin catching the gold lobby lights, natural hair twisted up and secured with what appeared to be, he narrowed his eyes, a pencil. She had the audacity to use a pencil as a hair accessory in a 5-star hotel, and somehow it looked intentional. The porter was laughing too, wiping his eyes. Seung-woo stood at the entrance, hand still on the revolving door, and felt something he could not immediately name. Not attraction, or not only that, it was something closer to confusion. The clinical distance he'd maintained around this assignment suddenly felt thin. He composed himself in under a second. He was very good at that. He had a plan. He would execute it. The introduction happened the next evening at a private dinner hosted by a mutual business contact, something Seung-woo had quietly engineered 3 weeks in advance. He was introduced as a Seoul-based investor interested in Lagos real estate. Victor shook his hand with the smile of a man who didn't know he was already losing. Imani sat 2 seats down, eating jollof rice with focused pleasure and contributing sharp, clear observations about West African infrastructure development that made 2 Harvard economists at the table shift uncomfortably. She was an urban planner. She'd built her own consulting firm by age 27. Victor hadn't handed her anything. She'd carved her own name before he ever offered to attach his to it. Seung-woo recalibrated everything he thought he knew about her in real time. When they were introduced directly, she looked at him with dark eyes that did something he was unaccustomed to. They assessed him back. Not nervously, not flirtatiously. Professionally, the way you'd evaluate a building's foundation before deciding whether it was worth entering. Choi Seung-woo, she repeated, like she was confirming the spelling. I read your paper on vertical community infrastructure in Seoul, the one in the Asian Urban Review. He blinked, one blink barely noticeable. You read academic journals on urban planning. I write for academic journals on urban planning, she said. Your thesis on displacement prevention was interesting. Your conclusion was wrong, but the framework was interesting. Silence rippled around the table. Seung-woo looked at her for a long moment. Then, for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt something flicker upward at the corner of his mouth that wasn't calculated. Wrong how? He asked. She told him, clearly, without softening it, for 11 minutes. He didn't stop listening once. 6 weeks later, Seung-woo proposed. Not to Imani, not yet. He proposed the arrangement to Victor first, a merger of assets, formalized through marriage. Victor's expression moved through surprise, calculation, and greed in quick succession before settling on enthusiasm. A Choyadami alliance would be seismic, the kind of thing that moved markets. Victor saw legacy. He saw protection. He saw his life's work secured. He didn't see the trapdoor built into every clause. Then Seungwoo went to Manny. She lived in a clean, unfussy apartment in Victoria Island. Bookshelves on every wall, a drafting table by the window. She opened the door herself, no housekeeper, no assistant, wearing paint-stained linen trousers and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She'd clearly been working. She looked at him the way she always did. Like he was a structure she was still deciding whether to trust. "You didn't call first," she said. "I didn't want you to prepare a defense," he said honestly. She stepped back and let him in. That surprised him too. She didn't ask questions from behind a closed door, didn't perform caution. She simply made a decision and acted on it. He was starting to understand that this was simply how she moved through the world. He sat. He told her the truth, part of it. The marriage, the merger, the terms. He offered her financial independence, a contractual exit after 2 years, full protection of her own assets. He did not tell her it was about revenge. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for what felt like a very long time. "You're asking me to sell 2 years of my life," she said finally. "I'm asking you to be compensated for 2 years of your time," he corrected. "That's the same thing dressed in nicer language." She tilted her head. "Why me?" "You're the logical choice. Victor trusts you. The alliance." "No," she shook her head slowly. "That's the corporate answer. I'm asking why you came here yourself instead of sending a lawyer." He had no prepared answer for that. "Because I wanted to see your face when I asked," he almost said. "Because every other person I've made an offer to either said yes too fast or said no too fast, and I have no idea what you'll do." What he said instead was, "I respect your intelligence. I thought it warranted a direct conversation." She studied him for another long moment. Then she said something that lodged itself in his chest like a splinter he'd be pulling at for months. "You're not used to being read, are you? It makes you nervous." He wasn't nervous. He was never nervous. "Think about it," he said, standing. "You have 72 hours. He walked to the door. She didn't call after him, didn't ask him to stay, didn't fill the silence with anything. He stepped into the hallway and heard the door close, quietly, not slammed, not reluctant. Just closed, like a period at the end of a sentence she'd already finished writing. In the elevator, alone, Choi Seung-woo pressed a thumb against his sternum where that splinter was still settling. She'd called it nervous. No one had called him nervous in 20 years. She called him at hour 71. "I have conditions," Imani said. "I expected nothing less," he replied. A pause, then, 3 of them are non-negotiable. "Tell me." "Not over the phone." Another pause, shorter. "And Seung-woo, I know this is about more than a merger. I don't know what yet, but I will find out." The line went quiet. He stared at his phone for a full 10 seconds after she hung up. She already knew something was wrong, and she was walking toward it anyway. For the first time in this entire operation, Choi Seung-woo felt the ground shift slightly under his feet, not from danger. From something far more destabilizing. Imani's 3 non-negotiable conditions were not what he expected. He'd prepared for financial demands, a higher settlement figure, perhaps a penthouse in Seoul, shares in a subsidiary. He'd sat across from enough negotiators to know that people almost always led with money because money was safe. Money didn't reveal anything about you except your price. Imani's conditions revealed everything. They met at a quiet corner table in a restaurant she chose, not the kind of place he usually occupied, no Michelin stars, no dress code, but the food arrived fast and hot, and the owner called her by name. She was already seated when he arrived, both conditions he noted without comment. She slid a single handwritten page across the table. He read it once, then again. Condition 1, no performance of affection in private. What we present publicly is a professional agreement between 2 adults. Behind closed doors, we are colleagues. Nothing more, nothing less. Condition 2, my work continues uninterrupted. My firm, my clients, my projects. You do not interfere, redirect, or absorb my professional identity into the Choi brand. Condition 3, if at any point I discover the full truth of why this marriage exists, and I will discover it, you tell me yourself before I find it elsewhere. You owe me that dignity. Seung-woo set the page down. You wrote the third condition, knowing I'm hiding something. I wrote the third condition because you're hiding something, she said. Everyone who enters a room the way you do is carrying something they haven't put down yet. How do I enter a room? She looked at him calmly, like you're already planning the exit. He picked up his water glass, set it down. It was the closest thing to a fidget he ever allowed himself. Agreed, he said, all three. She nodded once, then picked up the menu. Good, now order something. You look like you haven't eaten a meal that wasn't served in a boardroom in about a decade. He almost laughed. It was a near thing, a pressure in his chest that didn't quite find the exit. He caught it, flattened it, and looked at the menu. But the pressure remained. The wedding was held in Seoul, 12 weeks later. Intimate by Billionaire standards, 200 guests, a venue with clean architectural lines and winter light, cherry blossoms that had been coaxed slightly early by a horticulturist Seung-woo had retained for this specific effect. Everything was precise. Everything was curated. Every detail had been reviewed by his team 3 times. Then Imani walked in, and none of the curation mattered. She wore ivory, a gown with a deeply scooped back, her natural hair styled into an elaborate crown threaded with small gold accents that caught the light like embers. She walked without hesitation, without nerves, without performing the wide-eyed trembling that the room seemed to be waiting for. Her chin was level. Her eyes, when they found his at the altar, were clear and watchful and entirely, impossibly calm. The crowd murmured. The murmur had a specific texture, the confused appreciation of people who'd expected a transaction and were being shown something they couldn't quite categorize. Seung-woo stood still as she reached him. He was good at stillness. It was one of his most effective weapons. But when she stopped in front of him and he saw up close that she was not afraid, not performing, not bracing for impact the way almost every person who stood before him eventually did, something in his posture altered by a fraction. Not visible to anyone in the room. Visible to her. She tilted her head slightly, a question without words. Are you all right? He straightened. Yes. They said their vows, clean, legal, nothing poetic. He'd written nothing sentimental into them deliberately. She had not added anything either. That, somehow, felt more honest than anything laced with borrowed romance would have. When the officiant said you may kiss your bride, Seung-woo paused just one beat and then leaned forward and pressed his lips to her cheek. Warm skin, a scent like cedar and something citrus. He stepped back immediately. Appropriate, controlled. Imani turned to face the applause with a small, composed smile. Only he was close enough to hear her murmur under her breath. Smooth save. His Seoul penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a Choi Global building in Gangnam. Floor-to-ceiling glass, minimalist architecture, a city view that looked like a circuit board lit up at night. It was beautiful the way a museum was beautiful, impressive, cold, not designed for comfort. Imani walked through it on the first night, slowly, touching nothing, just looking. He watched her from the kitchen island, where he was pouring 2 glasses of water. You live like someone who doesn't want to leave fingerprints, she said finally. It's efficient. It's a warning sign. She turned to face him, leaning against the glass wall with her arms crossed, the city blazing behind her like she'd summoned it. You can exist here. I need to live here. There's a difference. What do you need? She was quiet for a moment, like she hadn't expected him to ask that simply. Books visible, not in a library room on shelves in rooms where you can see them. A drafting table by natural light. Coffee that isn't made by a machine with 17 settings, a kettle and a press, that's all. And one wall I can put things on. Notes, sketches, references, one wall that can be used. He looked at the pristine white wall to his left, which had held nothing for the 3 years he'd lived here. Done, he said. She blinked, That's it, no negotiation. You said what you needed. Why would I negotiate against your comfort in your own home? Something moved across her face. Not quite surprise. Something quieter and more unsettling than surprise, because he couldn't name it and he named everything. She took the glass of water he held out and said, "Thank you." Those two words in her voice, in that kitchen, at that hour, they landed differently than gratitude usually did for him. Usually gratitude tasted like power. Someone acknowledging they owed you something. This tasted like nothing he had vocabulary for. 3 months in, Seung-woo made his first mistake. It wasn't a business error, he didn't make. It was smaller and more catastrophic. It happened at a private dinner with his inner circle, 6 men who had served him loyally for over a decade, men who knew the architecture of the revenge plan, who knew Victor Adami's name the way surgeons know the name of a tumor. Imani had joined the dinner because it was expected. She sat at his left, engaged where appropriate, quiet where quieter was smarter. He'd noticed over 3 months that she understood rooms. She could read power dynamics and social weather with an accuracy that his most senior advisors occasionally missed. The conversation turned carefully to the Adami acquisition timeline. Seung-woo guided it there deliberately, keeping his voice level and his language clean, nothing that would translate as sinister to an outside ear. But then one of his men, Kim Yi-hoon, loyal but occasionally careless, raised his glass and said, with a smirk aimed at Seung-woo, to the old man finally getting what was owed. The toast was drunk. Seung-woo did not look at Imani. He should have looked at Imani. Because when he finally did, 20 minutes later, her face had not changed. She was still composed, still present, still making easy conversation with the man to her right. But her left hand, resting on the table near his, had curled slightly, not a fist, just a quiet gathering of fingers, like someone bracing for cold. She knew, she'd caught it. He said nothing. He told himself he would handle it. He told himself the timeline was still intact, the plan was still sound. She didn't have enough pieces yet. He went to sleep at midnight. When he woke at 3 a.m., she was at the drafting table by the window, city lights spread below her, working in silence. Not unusually, she often worked late. But he lay in the dark, watching the silhouette of her against the glass and felt, for the first time in his adult life, something that was the precise opposite of control. Guilt. It was unfamiliar. It sat in his chest like a stone he hadn't swallowed, but found there anyway. The call came on a Tuesday. Imani took it in the hallway, which was unusual. She never self-consciously removed herself from rooms. He heard only the last 4 seconds before she appeared in the doorway of his study, and her face had done something he had never seen it do. It had gone completely still, not calm, still, the way things go still before a fracture. "Victor had a heart attack," she said. "He's in ICU." Seung-woo set down his pen. He kept his expression neutral, composed, the face he wore for crises, because he was a man who had prepared for variables. He had not prepared for the way she would look at him in this moment. Not for sympathy, not asking him to comfort her, looking at him the way someone looks at a locked door when they've just found the key. "He's the target," she said, quietly, without drama. "That's what this is, that's what Yi-hoon meant." The silence between them lasted 6 seconds. "Imani." "Don't." Her voice was soft and devastatingly steady. "Don't manage me right now. I'm not a situation." She walked to the window. He watched her stand there, arms at her sides, looking out at Seoul the way she looked at blueprints, searching for the load-bearing elements, the places something could collapse. When she finally turned around, her eyes held something that broke something in him he hadn't known was still intact. "Tell me the truth," she said, "all of it." Condition 3. He had agreed. He had always known this moment would come. He had built the contract around it, had filed it under manageable future variable. But standing in front of Imani Brooks, his wife, watching her hold herself together with a dignity he had never earned and didn't deserve, Choi Seung-woo understood something that no boardroom, no acquisition, no act of revenge had ever taught him. Some debts cannot be paid with money. Some things, once broken, don't negotiate. He sat down. He told her everything. He talked for 40 minutes without stopping. That alone was unprecedented. Choi Seung-woo did not narrate. He issued directives, he made arguments, he presented positions. He did not sit across from another human being in the small hours of the morning and confess. It wasn't architecture he'd ever built into himself. But Imani sat in the armchair across from him, feet tucked under her, and she listened the way she always listened, completely, without performance, without interrupting to insert her own reaction. So he kept going. He told her about Chairman Park, a self-made man from Busan who'd spent 30 years building an architectural engineering firm that was quietly revolutionary, designs that prioritized community over spectacle, affordable structures that didn't insult the people who lived in them. He'd taken a 22-year-old Seung-woo under his wing when every other door in Seoul was still locked, had taught him that wealth without philosophy was just hoarding, that a building should serve the human being first and the skyline second. He told her how Victor Adami had come into their world under the guise of partnership, a Lagos Seoul joint development project, culturally significant, architecturally ambitious. How over 18 months of collaboration, Victor had extracted every proprietary design system, every structural innovation, every intellectual framework Chairman Park had spent his career developing. How he'd then quietly terminated the partnership on a technicality, registered the methodologies under Adami Holdings' intellectual property portfolio, and sued Chairman Park for breach of a clause so deeply buried in the original contract that 3 lawyers had initially missed it. He told her about the legal fees that bled Chairman Park dry, about watching a man who had never once moved through the world with his elbows out get systematically dismantled by someone who moved with nothing else, about visiting Chairman Park in the hospital the month before he died, in a ward that was a long distance from where he deserved to be, and hearing the old man say, with no bitterness, only a terrible exhaustion, "I trusted the wrong room, Seung-woo. Read every room before you walk in." He had not cried then, he didn't cry now. But his voice changed texture on that last sentence. Something in it thinned, briefly, like light through a fault in stone. Imani was quiet for a long time after he finished. "The acquisition," she said eventually. "You were going to take Adami Holdings apart, dismantle Victor's legacy the way he dismantled Chairman Park's." "Yes." "Using me as the mechanism." "Yes." Another silence, longer. He endured it because he owed it to her every second of it. "And the heart attack changes your timeline." "It complicates it," he said carefully. "A man in ICU cannot be held accountable in the ways I designed." She looked at him with those eyes that always seemed to be finding the load-bearing wall. "You mean it's harder to destroy someone who's already broken?" He said nothing. "Does it feel the way you thought it would?" she asked. The question landed somewhere unexpected. He'd rehearsed the endgame thousands of times. The moment Victor understood what was happening, the moment the legal documents arrived, the moment Choi Seung-woo stood in the wreckage of everything the man had stolen and finally exhaled. He'd carried that image for 3 years like a compass. "I haven't arrived there yet," he said. "I don't think you'll find what you're looking for when you do." Her voice wasn't gentle. It wasn't cruel either. It was simply honest, the way a structural assessment is honest, not unkind, just unwilling to lie about what it finds. "You've been building toward a moment that's supposed to give Chairman Park back to you. It won't. No acquisition does that." Seung-woo stood up and walked to the window. The city burned quietly below. "You're not going to ask me to stop," he said. It wasn't a question. "No," she said. "It's not my grief to manage, but I'm telling you what I see." A pause. "What are you actually afraid will happen if you let it go?" He turned. She was watching him with an expression he'd cataloged over 6 months of careful study and still couldn't fully translate. It wasn't pity. It wasn't judgment. It was something more patient than either of those things. Something that had decided, for reasons he couldn't yet understand, that he was worth the full attention. "That it will have meant nothing," he said. "That a man who deserved 30 more years of his life will have simply vanished, without consequence." Imani nodded slowly. "That's not about Victor," she said. "That's about witness. You want someone to confirm it happened, that it was real, that he mattered." The stone in his chest shifted. She'd found it. The exact thing he hadn't had words for in 3 years, *L. The call came 3 days later, not from the hospital. From Victor himself. He was out of ICU, stabilized, and he was asking to see a Manny, not unusual. But the message he sent through the family lawyer contained a sentence that Seung-woo almost missed when a Manny showed him the transcript. "Tell her I'm ready to tell her the truth about her parents." The room went very quiet. Imani's parents had died in a car accident when she was 7. She'd been raised by Victor Ademi from that point forward, an act of guardianship she'd always understood as generous, if complicated. She looked at Seung-woo with an expression he'd never seen on her face before, uncertainty. Not fear, just the specific disorientation of someone whose map has just been redrawn without warning. "I'm coming with you," he said. She didn't argue. They flew to Lagos the next morning. Victor Ademi in a hospital bed was still a formidable man, but formidable the way a decommissioned structure is formidable, all the weight of what it used to hold visible in its frame. He looked at Seung-woo when they entered with the eyes of someone who had done the math and finally arrived at the correct answer. "You married her to get to me," Victor said, no preamble. "Yes," Seung-woo said. Victor looked at Imani. "Are you all right?" "I'm managing," she said, in the careful tone she used when she was feeling more than she intended to show. "You said you had something to tell me." Victor was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had the specific quality of a man setting down something heavy he'd carried so long it had reshaped his spine. "Your father," he said, "was my business partner, 28 years ago, before Lagos, before any of this." He paused. "He was also the person who first introduced me to a Korean architect whose design philosophy changed how I understood buildings. A man named Park." The air in the room changed. Imani went still. "What are you saying?" "Your father and Chairman Park were collaborators, close ones. Your father died before the partnership with Park fully developed. The accident was real, I want to be clear about that. But the intellectual foundation I built my early career on, the design methodologies I later registered, that I later used against Park, some of those ideas originated from your father too, from both asterisk of them." He closed his eyes briefly. "I didn't steal from a stranger. I stole from the work of 2 men I had actually loved." Seung-woo was very, very still. Imani's hand found the arm of the chair beside her. "And you raised me," she said slowly, "knowing that." "I raised you because asterisk of that," Victor said. "I owed your father a debt I couldn't repay to him directly." His eyes, tired and unclouded for perhaps the first time, moved to Seung-woo. "I've known who you were since before this marriage. I knew this was coming. I let it come because—" his voice fractured slightly, "because Park deserved someone to fight for him, even if it had to be this way." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Seung-woo had ever stood inside. They didn't speak much on the flight back to Seoul. Somewhere over the Atlantic, Imani fell asleep in the seat beside him, not leaning on him, but close, her head tilted toward the window, her breathing deep and even. She slept the way she did everything, without self-consciousness, without performance, fully committed to the act itself. He sat in the dark of the cabin and looked at the document his legal team had prepared, the full acquisition structure, every clause designed to fracture Ademi Holdings methodically, to scatter what Victor had built to the 4 winds. He read it for a long time. Then he closed it. He did not delete it. He wasn't a man who made decisions at 30,000 feet in the middle of the night from a place of emotional disruption. But he held it closed and sat with what Imani had said in his study 3 nights ago. You want someone to confirm it happened, that it was real, that he mattered. Chairman Park had mattered. The buildings were still standing, quiet and dignified in 3 countries, serving the communities they'd been designed for. The students Park had mentored were now architects themselves, carrying methodologies forward that Victor had registered under his own name, but could not actually own because ideas, genuinely revolutionary ones, have a way of persisting regardless of whose signature sits above them. Chairman Park had mattered. And Seung-woo had spent 3 years trying to prove it by destroying something, when the proof had been standing in concrete and inhabited by living people all along. He'd been looking for the wrong evidence. He turned and looked at Amani sleeping beside him. She had walked into this knowing something was wrong, had signed the contract anyway, not from naivety, but from a specific kind of courage that assessed risk clearly and chose to proceed. She'd offered him her conditions: dignity, honesty, autonomy. She'd put her name next to his and trusted him with the architecture of 2 years of her life, and he had built the whole thing on a foundation he'd never disclosed. He owed her more than the truth he'd already given. He owed her a choice about what came near. He woke her gently when they began descent. She came awake the way she always did, immediately, without disorientation, blinked once, looked at him. "I'm going to restructure the acquisition," he said. "Not abandon it entirely. Victor still owes a formal acknowledgement and a legal restoration of Chairman Park's intellectual property rights. That part I will finish. But the dismantlement," he paused, "I'm reducing it." She watched him. "It won't bring him back," he said. "You were right about that, but a formal record, a public correction of the attribution, means his name goes back onto work that carries it. That's what he actually deserved. Not Victor's ruin, his own name in the right place." Imani held his gaze for a long, measuring moment. "That took courage," she said. "It took you," he said, simply, without strategy. Something shifted in her expression then, not dramatic, not cinematic. Just a small, quiet opening, like a window in a room that had been closed too long. "Our 2 years are almost up," she said. "I know. I have conditions again." He felt something move through his chest, warm, unfamiliar, not unpleasant. "Tell me." 3. "Of course." She looked at him steadily. 1. You stop performing the version of yourself that was built for boardrooms and start practicing the one I met at 3 a.m. in a kitchen in Lagos, who asked what I needed and just did it. He nodded. 2. You come to Lagos with me next month. Not for business. I'm presenting a community housing project in mainland, and I want you to see what a building looks like when it's built for people first. Done. She paused. The cabin lights were coming up softly for landing. Her face in that light was warm and certain and entirely, devastatingly unafraid. 3, she said. Start this over properly. No contracts, no exits built in, no terms. A pause, if you want to. Choi Seung-woo, who had not needed to ask for anything twice in over 2 decades, who had built his entire life on the principle that vulnerability was a structural weakness, who had married this woman as a weapon and discovered she was a mirror, looked at Imani Brooks and felt every calculation he'd ever made become irrelevant. I want to, he said. 6 months later, a small but significant legal event occurred in Seoul that most of the business press considered a footnote. Adami Holdings publicly acknowledged and restored attribution of 17 foundational design methodologies to the estate of the late Chairman Park Young-yi. No courtroom, no drama, a press statement and a formal correction in the academic record. Seung-woo framed the statement. He put it on the one wall in the penthouse that had notes and sketches on it now, Imani's wall, which had migrated through 3 rooms until it occupied the main living space, covered in project references and ideas, and one photograph she'd added quietly. A picture of a building in Busan, simple and dignified, that a plaque now identified correctly. He didn't announce it. He didn't explain it. She saw it one morning over coffee and went still for a moment. Then she turned and looked at him across the kitchen. You found it, she said. You showed me where to look. She crossed the kitchen and stood in front of him. This woman who had walked into a room with a man the whole world feared, and simply, infuriatingly, refused to be afraid, and put her hand flat against his chest, over the place where a splinter had lodged itself the first evening in a Lagos hotel lobby. For the record, she said quietly, I knew it was a bad idea from the beginning. The marriage. Falling for you. A small, warm, irresistible smile. Terrible timing. Terrible circumstances. You were hiding things. I had better options. He covered her hand with his. And yet, she agreed. Outside, Seoul moved in its relentless, electric way. In Lagos, a community housing project was 3 weeks from completion. 40 families moving into buildings designed with the philosophy that people deserve beauty and function in equal measure. a philosophy that had originated between two men who'd understood that long before either of their names were attached to anything significant. Inside the penthouse, on the wall of notes and sketches and one correctly labeled photograph, the room held evidence of two people who had found each other in the wrong story and built a better one from the wreckage. Some walls are built to protect us. The right person doesn't knock them down. They simply stand close enough, long enough, that we take them down ourselves.